go. I think I lost you there for a second.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm going to record this and I'll post it on Facebook. I do think it's just an appropriate time to discuss Lamentations, and so this is
definitely
the video on Lamentations itself.
The Book of Lamentations. It's a unique book in the Old Testament that contains 5 poems from an anonymous author who survived and is now reflecting back on the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem and the destruction and the exile that followed. Remember the whole story from the Book of 2 Kings. The fall of Jerusalem and the exile was the most horrendous catastrophe in Israel's history up to this point. So remember, God had promised Abraham the land. He'd given David victory to make Jerusalem Israel's capital. And from David came the royal line of kings. You had God's presence there in the temple, and that's where the priests maintained the rituals of Israel's worship. And after 500 years of all of this history, in the summer of 587 BC, the city fell to Babylon. It was all decimated and gone. So the Lamentations is a memorial to the pain and confusion of the Israelites that followed this. Now, found here a number of things. Their angst, expressed states of human evil just informed contrast how things in the streets, but now they beg for food. The wealthy used to eat lavish meal they can find in dirt. And the years used to be full of splendor, but now they're famished and dirty and unrecognizable. And the anointed king from the line of David has been captured. So the poem's power comes from the shock of these contrasts, the depth of the suffering. And the poem poet acknowledges God as the like our own experiences. This very crucial part of journey. That's what the Book of Lamentations is all about.
I like that brokenness of the Lamentations at the end. What did you think about this video? What stood out to you?
Extremely timely about the protesting, and it makes me think, people protest, I think, to have other people hear them protest. Do they protest to God and go to him first and tell them what they're worried about, stressed about, what they're sad about? I would just wonder, because I know sometimes I don't go straight to him. I go straight to somebody that I want to talk to. I'm so mad, I'm so sad, I'm so something. But it reminded me to go straight to him first rather than maybe somebody.
It's a really good point. I don't know why, we do that, but I do that all the time too, and it's like, even in the present situation, in my life, it's like, did you pray about it?
Mm-hmm.
No.
I know.
That should be the first thing I do, but
right.
Yeah, we don't think about it, and that does cause problems when we don't take it to him first. Yeah, definitely.
I think maybe I just want to hear somebody say, oh, you're right. Maybe that's what I want to hear right off the bat, because I know the people I can go to that will say that, and I know the people that I will go to that will not say that. So I know who to choose first, but really need to go to God first and prayer about it very first, and then try to listen, because that's a big deal that I've not been really listening lately. Just talking and talking.
Yeah. Well, and I like this book because it really does kind of have that example of talking And there is a time to voice all of that. Even, you know, even in Lamentations, where they felt like a lot of their grief was their own fault, it's still okay to voice that, you know. And I really, what also stood out to me is the disordered and confused pain and grief. Like, and that really is, you know, how I think we feel right now is just, it's so disordered. It's so chaotic. And that just adds to the confusion and the pain.
Definitely.
So chapter 1, I like those videos because it really does go over that's what a big overview, a big picture of the book. But chapter 1, verse 1, how deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They've become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to her appointed festivals. All her gateways are desolate, her priests groan, her young women grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. Her foes have become her masters, her enemies are at ease. The Lord has brought her grief because of her many sins. Her children have gone into exile, captive before the foe. All the splendor has departed from daughter Zion. Her princes are like deer that find no pasture. In weakness, they have fled before the pursuer. And I just feel like this passage just exemplifies our trip to San Antonio, you know, just that it was deserted. This beautiful city that is normally very vibrant and just was, parts of it were destroyed and deserted. And but then also I kind of also thought about the cities in general, you know, with COVID-19, you know, just being deserted because everybody had to stay home. So do you ever feel like the punishment for sin outweighs the offense?
Yes.
Yeah. And I definitely think we saw that with George Floyd and, you know, just all that stuff. And kind of in the midst of all of this crazy stuff, do you ever blame God? You know, why did you do this? Why did you let this happen? I know I do. I know I see that a lot in my clients who've gone through pain. You know, they blame God. Have you ever done that?
Yes, I have, and I really try not to.
Yeah.
I think about, well, this is a fallen, broken world, and we have free will, but yeah, there's a spot in the back of my head that I'm like, well, he really could have stopped that, if he'd have wanted to. But I really try not to go there.
Yeah, it is hard not to, and it's hard to remember that ultimately we are, humans in general are responsible for the introducing all of this pain and death, to the world. It's, and I think part of that grief is because we know it should not have ever been this way.
Exactly.
It should not have, and God never intended it to be, but it is where we are at.
I know. Try to remember, I'm being refined.
Mm-hmm.
Going through the fire, I'm being refined. It's like I have to keep telling myself these kinds of things whenever times get rough. And
And I keep seeing too, over and over again, this instinct, I think, that we have to blame somebody. We want to blame somebody other than ourselves.
Right. That's huge right now.
Yeah. And it really doesn't do any good. It just kind of serves to isolate ourselves even further. Any other thoughts on that one?
There was a verse, I guess it was in 3, that I just loved, and I was trying to find it. Is it His mercies are new?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Every morning. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get there.
Okay. Awesome. That was always stands out to me. I'm like, oh, new day, new mercies.
Yes.
That was great.
Yeah. So we're gonna kind of just look over chapter 2 again.
Chapter 2 focuses on the fall of Jerusalem and how it was a consequence of Israel's sin and was brought about by God's wrath, which is the key word in this poem. Now, it's important to remember that in the Bible, God's wrath is not spontaneous, volatile anger. The biblical poets and prophets, they use this word to talk about God's justice. So Israel had entered a covenant agreement with God, and for centuries they've been violating it by worshiping other gods, perpetrating injustice, oppressing the poor. And so, yes, God is slow to anger, but he eventually does get angry at human evil, and he will bring his just anger in the form of punishment. In the case of Jerusalem, this involved allowing Babylon to come and conquer the city. And so this poem is acknowledging that God's wrath is justified, but this doesn't keep the poet from lamenting and asking God to show compassion once again.
So kind of the angle that I want to look at here is the result of leadership. We can follow the wrong leaders, and that can lead to this destruction. And I think we're in the middle of that as well. Some of our leaders have just really fallen down on leading well. How do you think that has impacted our world, our situations?
I think that not careful thought about what some leaders say really gets some people fired up to go and do the opposite of what he says. Okay, Donald Trump, like he just spouts off at the mouth sometimes, and we're like, why can't you just let your advisors like go over what you're about to say before you put it out there? And so it gets people even more angry and stirred up, and more things happen. And
yeah.
It's wild. It's a wild time right now.
It is. Well, and so, if we think about how the rest of the world views our country, they are going to hold us, the people, accountable for the leaders that we choose. And God holds us accountable for the leaders that we choose to follow. So, I mean, what does that mean for us?
I don't know. I don't think it's very good. I mean, I try to vote what I know to be correct, but I don't know if people actually do vote or even do it to where, I don't know. It's just, I never really expected Donald Trump to get president, but here we are.
Yeah, here we are. Well, and too, I think for the upcoming election, that's very important as well.
Mm-hmm.
But not even just nationally, but locally. I have a different kind of perspective because I always have the same pastor, but
Yeah.
But even in our churches, it's important to follow a leader who is following God.
Definitely.
And if I know many churches have chosen a leader who has not followed. It has brought about a lot of pain and destruction. Because of their actions. And so it's just something to think about, again, amidst all this turmoil that we're experiencing, that is impacted by who we follow. Chapter 5 is kind of a corporate prayer of contrition, they're sorry for what they did, and restoration, and it reminds us to pray for the future. This verse specifically, but you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. And somebody brought up this week that we kind of see our situations as the end of time. But, future generations are going to look back on this time and see the choices that we made, and kind of judge whether we acted well or not. And so sometimes we presume, we expect God to be on our side, right? And act like we think he should act. But he doesn't, he doesn't have our perspective. And sometimes that's hard to remember too, that he has a different perspective than we do. And it's not that he needs to be on our side, we need to be on his side, whatever that means.
Just trust him, I think, because he sees the big picture.
Right, yeah.
We only see what we do.
Mm-hmm. But why is it important for us to humble ourselves and see what we have done wrong, in general?
I think it helps us, it leads us to repentance, which leads us into prayer, which leads us into more close communion with him and to come back to where he wants us to be. Mm-hmm. If you stay humble and realize, I've done wrong and I need to turn from this and go back the other direction, and then we have to seek him, realize that we need him through everything.
Right. Yeah. And I think you said it, it helps us to remember that we rely on him. We have to have him. We need him. Because when left to our own devices, we end up destroying everything.
Always bad. It's always bad.
Yeah. So going back to chapter 3, verse 20 or 19. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. That last verse, is really stands out to me. For
Yes, I love that.
Yeah. Again, kind of reiterating what we said earlier, this is not God's design. This is not what God intended the world to be. All this pain and destruction, this is not him. He doesn't willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. And yet,
so good to be reminded of that.
Yeah. And yet we blame him, and he is gracious and loving in response. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh every morning.
I love that so much because it reminds me to remind myself of the character of God whenever I get so consumed with what's happening in the news and like, why is this happening? Forget about who he is and all the good things that it says in here about him. He doesn't willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. He remembers them. His love is great. His faithfulness is new every morning. He's good to those who hope in him. Like, all these things are characteristics that I need to remember and remind and go over.
Yeah, I think we all do, and especially when we're blaming him, that verse, he doesn't willingly bring grief to anyone. I know that, like, for my friend who experienced her son dying, that doesn't make it all better. And I think that really is why Jesus cried when his friend died, is that it wasn't supposed to be like this. He never wanted it to be like this. But he's faithful, and his mercies are new every morning. Lord, I pray that you would just write this verse on our hearts, that we would remember this morning your grace, your mercy, that we would remember this week your grace and your mercy, your faithfulness, you never wanted the world to be like this, and it grieves you. And yet you give hope, you give grace, you give mercy. Thank you for that. I just pray in your precious Son's name. Amen. Well, thank you for being faithful